In today's episode, I'm going to show you how to do a basic mix. I'm not necessarily going to show you how to do the best way to mix. I'm not going to show you the ultimate way that the masters do mixing. I'm going to show you how I personally mix and how I want to teach you how to mix. This isn't the basics of basics. I'm not going to show you how EQ works. I'm not going to show you how compression works. I'm not going to show you the basics of using a DAW. I have done videos on those before, so there are links up there if you don't check them out. This is just, okay, if you know how the tools work, what to do with these tools. Okay, so what you're currently seeing is a track. It's a pretty basic instrumental track. There are drums, bass, and guitars. You'll notice I've actually split it into two different parts. Like I've got drums up here, and I've also got drums down here, same with bass and one guitar, and down here I've got bass and three guitars. That is because I want the beginning of the song to be affected. I want it to be really quiet and kind of sound like it's going to come out of a radio. So what I've done is I've got all of the audio for that section of the song and I've put it all on completely different tracks to what the rest of the song would be. So I've only got an intro section right here, but the rest of the song could carry on there and they would be the tracks that I would use. I've done that mainly just so that I can show you how to affect multiple tracks with just one plugin, for example, rather than having to affect this track and then this track and then this track and then this track. I can just do one thing and I can affect everything. Obviously I don't want these down here to be affected, so that's why they're on different tracks. Obviously the purpose of this video is just to show you how I would do a basic mix and kind of talk you through it, but before I do that, I'm better off just showing you the track and then obviously I can do a before and after once it's finished. So this is what the track sounds like. So it's pretty basic, just a riff. What I have in terms of parts, so I've got a normal drum section which I've split into kick, snare, toms and cymbals, mainly because I've got it MIDI. On an actual drum kit you would have kick, snare, each tom would have its own mic, and then the cymbals generally you would have two overheads, one left, one right, and then a hi-hat mic. I don't have that because I am using MIDI, but it doesn't really affect the mixing process because cymbals, you don't need to mix that much anyway. So this is just what the drums sound like on their own. And we have bass. We've done the bass as if it is going through a pedal and then through an amp. We have emulated that, so if you look in my mixer, I've got a gate on it, I've got some pedals on it, and I've got a bass amp on it. I've done the same with the guitars as well. That's just emulating what it would normally be like if you just put a mic to your amp. I've essentially just emulated what's happening there. So this is what the bass sounds like. So that's just normal distorted bass. I've kept a little bit of clean signal in there. That is mainly just so that I can keep some of the low end because sometimes distortions will take that out. And then the guitars, I have two guitars here, a left and a right. Notice that they aren't panned yet. I've not touched this at all, so they're both panned central and there are no volume changes across all of these tracks yet. This is what the left and right guitar sound like at the same time without panning. And then I also have a central guitar which is going to be kind of act as what a riff track would sound like, but because all three tracks are playing the riff, I didn't want to call it riff, so I've just called it central, and it is playing the riff, but it's playing an octave higher. So that is all that I have to work with. That is the basis of what an instrumental track would normally look like. I don't mean instrumental track in the terms of it's going to stay instrumental. It's just generally you'd mix the instruments first, add vocals on after. I am going to be doing an episode on mixing vocals into a mix, so look out for that. But today we are just going to be focusing on mixing the instruments. What I want to do is I'm going to just edit these tracks down here. I'm going to mix these tracks down here because the tracks up here I kind of want to keep quite rough in terms of the mix. I don't want it to sound as good as what the song is going to do, because when we come to affect all of these tracks all in one, we're going to make it sound worse and kind of like it's coming out of an old crappy radio or something anyway. So the mix doesn't really matter for those tracks. I might go in and mess about with it if I'm not getting the result that I want, but for now we're just going to focus on these tracks down here. So the first thing I'm going to do is start with panning. So I'm going to bring up the mixer, and literally all that I need to do is pan, guitar left all the way to the left, guitar right all the way to the right. I don't have to do that. I could do it slightly to the left and slightly to the right. Really, it's completely up to you with the track that you're working on. If you do have something going through the middle that is also the same instrument, panning them out wide will work. However, there's a thing called hole in the middle, where if you are panning a load of things to the left and a load of things to the right, and you don't have much coming through the center, you can kind of feel, it kind of feels as though there's a hole in the middle of your song. So just be aware of that. If it feels kind of empty, if your track feels kind of empty, that might be why. So maybe pulling the things that are panned out really wide in a little bit might solve that problem for you. I'll hit play. If you are listening on headphones, you will hear a difference. If you're not listening on headphones, you might not hear much of a difference, but I'd recommend listening to this episode with headphones anyway. So I will just do that, and then I'm going to start messing about with the volumes of all of these tracks. So it's the yellow tracks to the blue tracks. I'm ignoring the red tracks for now. So I'll just start messing about with the volumes and getting it so that it sounds kind of mixed. So that is a basic mix. That's not where we're going to stop here, don't worry, that's not it. All that I really did there was I pulled the guitars down a lot. You might notice this in a lot of popular music, but the guitars aren't that loud to actually serve the purpose that they have. Generally, bass will be a lot louder than the guitars themselves. It might even sound, especially if they're playing the same thing, like it sounds like really big guitars and the bass isn't doing much. But if you actually mute the bass, it turns out that it's the bass that's doing the majority of the work. Just be aware of that when you're mixing, that you don't actually have to have the guitars as loud as maybe you think you do, and you'll actually benefit from a better mix because of that, because you can have the stuff that's creating the melody and that kind of stuff a little bit louder because they aren't being overwhelmed by the other guitars. That's kind of what we did with the central guitar. We can push that a hell of a lot louder because in the mix with just these three guitars, that's the bit that kind of matters, but it would feel really empty without the others. So the entire thing would feel really empty without those rhythm-esque guitars, but really they aren't actually that loud to serve the purpose that they are doing. That with bass in just makes it sound super beefy, with it being even louder than everything else. Remember that it's occupying an entirely different frequency spectrum. It's on the low end, the guitars are on the high end, so really they complement each other more than drown each other out. That with just drums that punch straight through gives us the entire final sound. One thing with mixing drums into a mix, something that feels a little bit artistic in terms of how people do it, because it differs from mix to mix drastically, and that is cymbal volume. There will be a lot of tracks that you listen to where you can barely hear the cymbals, and then there'll be some where the cymbals are sat on top of everything. So there is no real rule with cymbals. In terms of kick, snare, and toms, you just want to be able to hear it punch. If it feels like you're struggling to listen to it, it probably needs to be louder. You're best off having the drums a bit too loud than a bit too quiet, is a general rule of thumb. So what I'm going to go through now is I'm going to use an EQ. I've talked about EQ in this series before, so I'm not going to necessarily go through the ins and outs of exactly what it is, but I do just want to kind of go through what I would do to this track in regards to EQ, and I'm going to do the same for compression. So I'm going to start with bass, mainly because the kick, snare, toms, and cymbals have already really been perfected in terms of their sound. If I was going to EQ them, I would have to be doing that for artistic reasons rather than just perfecting the sound because they are samples. So doing it with the bass, I've just soloed the bass, and I'm gonna listen to the bass and kind of see what I want to make it sound like, if that makes sense. I'll talk you through it as I do it. So the first thing that I kind of see there is that I've got a lot, because of the distortion, I've got a lot of like mids and high end in there that's kind of, it's giving a kind of crispness when it's on its own, which is great. But in terms of the mix, I think we'll probably benefit from either boosting the low end or taking out some of the high mids. Not a lot, just something that really emphasizes that it is the bass and it is kind of umphing in there without it feeling overly like what a melodic instrument would necessarily sound like. You can also turn on like analyzers that will show you visually what you're listening to. So as you can see here, that we've got the bass frequencies around here, and then we've got like the mids that I was talking about, where obviously we're getting quite a bit around 1K and 2K. So I'm gonna pull the shelf, and I'm just gonna knock it down just a tad, like literally -3 dB, just to emphasize the bass rather than the mids. There's not much of a difference, but it's just turning down that little bit of kind of clarity that we're getting with that. You might prefer the clarity, but I personally want it to be a little bit kind of actually low-end bass sound while keeping that distorted sound. So that's pretty basic. I'm gonna go through and I'm gonna do the exact same with the guitars. I'm gonna just listen to them. I'm gonna listen to the rhythms together because I'm gonna use the same EQ. I'm just gonna copy and paste it across. Just wondering what they feel like they need. Okay, so what I've done here is super subtle, but that's kind of what you need to be doing. Subtlety is key in mixing, because you end up recording something that might not sound overly great, and then you're like, okay, so let's make that sound as good as possible. So you maybe do some heavy EQing on it, some heavy compression on it, and then it still doesn't sound that great. That's probably because you've gone too far the other way. If something sounds really bassy, turning the bass all the way down on it won't necessarily make it sound better than the bassy version. Just being quite subtle about what you're doing will actually make the mix sound kind of professional and properly mixed. So all that I've done here is I've knocked off all the total low end. There's nothing around here that the guitar can be making that's going to sound any good. If it's making any frequencies around here, it's going to be low rumble that you really don't want in your mix. Anyway, you can say the same for like the super high end, but sometimes it adds a bit of a nice kind of fizz or just a bit of a clarity to what you're listening to. I'll do the I'll just do it now so that I actually turn it back up. I'll turn this really high frequency really high up so you can kind of hear what it is that actually what I've made louder. Fizzle. I think fizzle's probably the right word that I'm kind of getting from the fuzz that we're using. So this is obviously an acquired taste. You don't have to keep that kind of a sound in. Sometimes it can sound a little bit messy, but with this track, I want it to sound kind of that way. So that's why I've emphasized those frequencies a little bit. I've done the same pretty much from 2K upwards. Well, pretty much from 1K upwards. And then around 500, I've dropped it. There's a descriptive word that is used in mixing called boxy. It describes a type of sound, and that sound is this. I will emphasize it for you now, just to show you what it sounds like. Hear how it sounds kind of like the sound is encased within a box. It sounds muffled. It sounds like there's a speaker inside of something. That's not the sound that really you want to be going for with it in a mix. So generally, especially with guitars, I tend to drop 500, even if it's just a little bit, just so that it just takes away that little bit of muffled boxiness and kind of adds a clarity to what it is they've got. If you've got a lot of guitar tracks going off, you will definitely benefit from probably dropping 500 a little bit. Obviously it depends on the amp that you're using and the sounds and everything, so do it by ear, don't just flat out drop 50 no matter what, but it is worth knowing that that is something that I do on a regular basis, because generally when I'm recording guitars, 500 Hz seems to be a bit of a problem. So now that I've done that to one guitar, I'm gonna copy that straight over to the other guitar. They run through the exact same pedals, the exact same amp, so I know that they are exactly the same, so I know they need the exact same thing affecting, so this is now what they sound like. Okay, sounds alright. I'm gonna put that with the bass as well now that that's mixed, and just show you what that sounds like. Okay, that's great. I think from emphasizing that bass a little bit, I'm gonna just turn it down a wee bit. Now all that's left to do is get the EQ on the higher guitar. I'm gonna assume it's gonna be quite similar to the others, so I'm just gonna copy that across and then adjust as I see fit. So all I've done with this is literally just drop the low, mids and low end a little bit more, mainly because I want it to kind of stick out in the mix because it is the main riff. I just don't need that low end I don't need that track to be creating that low end because the bass is already doing that and the guitars need it to sound like guitars, but especially with this lead guitar, I don't necessarily need those frequencies in there, so I'm just gonna drop it a little bit. This is what the three mixed elements kind of sound like together. And what I'll do is I will just turn off the EQ and then turn it back on, just to kind of show on a broad scale what I've done. The unmixed version sounds a little bit less clear, a little bit muddier. There's not much difference, but you can definitely hear it there, and that is just this subtle mixing. I've just dropped the high end on the bass a little bit so that the low end of the bass is a little bit clearer. I've dropped the low end of the guitars more on the lead guitar than on the rhythm guitars. Lead guitar on the right, rhythm guitars on the left. But I've not done a great deal. I've definitely taken all of that super low end out on the guitars, which is really not needed, and I've just boosted the high end for a little bit of clarity on both the rhythm guitars and the lead guitar. That's pretty much it in terms of, I guess, creative mixing. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to compress, but what I tend to do with compression, unless I want something very specific sounding, I generally just use a rule of thumb or whatever and just stick to that generally. So I will show you how I compress bass and then guitars. So I just put on a normal compressor. So for bass, I normally use about a ratio of 6 to 1. That's potentially quite high depending on what you're doing. Some people will teach to do 3 to 1. I tend to do 6. That's just through practice, and this is what I prefer to do. And then what I'm looking for, this threshold applies the ratio after that point. So once I start bringing this threshold down, you will see that a volume reduction starts appearing on this gauge. Once it gets to about -6, that's where I'm going to want it to stay. The goal that I'm trying to get with this compression isn't an effect, it isn't a specific sound, it is just compressing all of the elements within the track so that any major peaks or any inconsistencies in volume are kind of leveled a little bit, so that if you do that across all of the tracks, they blend together a lot better. There's a lot less separation and kind of an unmixed feeling about the track, and once it's done, the track feels a lot more like one solid piece rather than different elements, because you're cutting out any peaks and any massive volume differences. It just blends together nicely, and that's kind of what a good mix sounds like. That's just, I guess, how the industry's gone. Unless it's compressed, it sounds unmixed. So I'll just start rolling the threshold back until I start seeing it be about -6. So I'll keep it around there. You'll see that it's staying around -6 and then jumping up a little bit on the peaks. That's potentially a good thing, because as a louder part is playing, it's reducing it more. That's obviously what you're going to want, so I'm going to keep it around there. Then I'll do the same with the guitars. Sometimes with the guitars I'll want a lesser ratio than 6. It all depends on the project itself. What I'm going to do is I'm going to, with the rhythms, put it to about 6, and then with the lead put it to about 3 or 4, mainly because I don't mind the lead part accenting a little bit more when it naturally does, because it's the part that I kind of want you to be listening to anyway. I don't necessarily need it to sit directly in the mix like I want the other 3 instruments to. So I'll do the same with both rhythm guitars. That is the basis of what I would do to mix those instruments. Obviously, I would do the same with drums, but really they're here just because that's what a track should sound like. But I'm not going to show you exactly how I would mix drums here. Because I'm using MIDI drums, the samples already sound really good, so I don't really need much EQing on them. And in terms of compression, because I don't have a real drummer playing, I don't need much compression on them at all, because I can kind of dial in the volume changes manually because I'm using MIDI. So just be aware that if you are recording real drums, you're going to need to go through the same process of EQ and compression. In terms of ratios, sticking around 3:1 really is a good rule of thumb to just kind of stick around. Play about with a bit heavier compression. Personally on toms, I quite like a bit more heavier compression, maybe 6:1, maybe 8:1, maybe 10:1. It all depends on kind of the sound that you want. With the EQ, just remember to be subtle. Don't do anything major. Potentially you could take a lot of the low end and add a lot of the click to a tom drum. That's stylistically what a lot of bands seem to be doing, especially like your post-hardcore pop punky kind of bands. A lot of the fills and stuff tend to cut through so much and have no kind of low end on the toms. That's not necessarily what toms actually sound like, but a lot of bands seem to do that in the mixing process. So I will kind of leave you with that. I get this is definitely not a how you should be mixing. This isn't a this is how everyone mixes. This is particularly how I mix, and if I was gonna show you the basics of mixing, that was what I would show you. So take that, experiment, do different things, try different ways of doing what I've shown you. So what I'm going to do next time is I'm going to show you buses, and I'm also going to show you how I'm going to affect all of these tracks all at the same time and achieve one kind of master effect. If you want to see more videos from this series, click on the left hand side of the screen, and if you want to see our best stuff playlist, click on the right hand side of the screen. You might have noticed that Wednesday videos are now back. I'm back from holiday, so we are back to normal on Music Lab. Yeah, see you on Saturday.